Hello friends, I am Jerry, and welcome to modeling a diorama of the Firefly Blue Ghost lander. Now this lander launched on a Falcon 9 earlier this year, 2025. It became the first successful United States lander to land on the surface of the moon since the Apollo program, sort of sticking with a theme of underappreciated or unheard of aerospace objects for my modeling series. If this ends up being a series, this is kind of a bit of an experiment. Here I'm making the heliospheric X-ray imager. This is supposed to be made out of gold foil, but I did not have any gold leaf. I only had aluminum on hand, and the painting process that I used to make the lander appear gold used orangish colored paint and a nice antique bronze color. I no longer had. Here I'm making the solar panels, which I was very happy with how these turned out. I've never used this process before, but I figure it ended up working out pretty well. I took a metal screen from what would be used for a screen door on like a patio or a window or something of that nature, and Mod Podged it to some dark blue fabric. That got me the nice dark blue background coloration with the metallic wires going through it. But it was a little bit too metallic, so at first I tried filing it down from the backside, but that didn't really work out too well. So what I finally settled on after much experimentation was taking blue food coloring, applying it to the metal side, which ended up dampening down the metal coloration and bringing out the blue of the fabric behind it, which was the exact effect that I was going for. Ended up leaving a nice dark blue with just hints of metal in it, which I then scraped off the excess with that same popsicle stick from earlier. And the X-Acto knife, not sure why I did that. Shouldn't do this to your X-Acto knives, it'll probably dull them very quickly. But I was very happy with how the end result of this solar panel turned out. And finally, to finish it, I gave a light coating of super glue over the top of it. That gave it a nice gloss and even stability across its surface. And also dampened down some of the blue color. It was a bit too blue. So then to make the engine for Blue Ghost, the main engine that would be used for the translunar injection burn, the braking burn, and also I believe was used for the deorbit burn. I used an old mechanical pencil that nobody really wanted around anymore, and it didn't really work too well, and decided to cut off the top of it, because it ended up being about the perfect shape for a bell nozzle. Though I did end up cutting it a bit too long the first time, so I ended up shortening it a little bit. Now, the engine of Blue Ghost that I am working on here apparently used a mixed oxides of nitrogen and hydrazine for its fuel, which up until doing the research for this video, I did not actually know there was such a thing as mixed oxides of nitrogen. I would have thought it would have used MMH or monomethylhydrazine. Here I am working on the GNSS receiver, which was also the other prominent feature on the top of the lander. I used the same method that I had used for the heliospheric X-ray imager, except this time I folded it in such a way so that there was a little flap sticking up out of the top to make that flat section that's more visible. And it was on to finally gluing everything down, and it turns out this was the hardest part of the entire project, because despite my nice new tweezers and pliers and everything to supposedly make this much easier, the worst part was my shaky hands. But in the end, I got there. And it was on to apply the solar. Now, I didn't know this until recently, but the Firefly Blue Ghost lander had 3 solar panels instead of just 2 like I had originally thought. There was one on the top, which was very hard to get reference material for because you can't find any images of what the top of the lander looked like. So I had to kind of guess a little bit, but I think I got pretty close. There I had just dropped it, which I thought for sure would have destroyed all of my progress, but it turns out it was fine, surprisingly. And then I very carefully attached all of the solar panels to their respective location. Now, sadly, I did not have any decals to put on this. I'm still trying to figure out a way of making decals for my model. Hopefully at some point I'll be able to do that, but this lander ended up not moving from its position of its final resting place, so I'm probably not going to be putting decals on it, regrettably. Even if I do figure out a way of how to do it. There I am putting the last remaining solar panels on. Then it was finally on to making the maneuvering thrusters, which I did by cutting out 0.5 centimeter thick slices of hot glue sticks, which I then melted with a torch to make little droplets, which I then cut in half. That gave me the nice half-spheroid shape that I wanted to make the cases around the engines themselves. And then to make the engines, I took small sections of metal wire and heated them up and stuck them inside of those droplets from earlier. And that gave me the nice shape that I wanted. Now, the Blue Ghost lander used these engines for the landing burn to set down on the surface of the moon. Because unlike previous landers which used their main engines, this one used these side engines to prevent dust kickup and have a bit finer control, as well as I believe for redundancy. I had to make 4 of these little pods, each with 2 wires in, and I had messed up a couple of them, so I ended up having to make 6 altogether. But I placed them on their respective sides. And finally was on to painting the engine. Now, I didn't end up needing to actually make the engine in the first place, because from its position on the final diorama, you wouldn't be able to see it anyway, but it's more for my own sake, I suppose. I coated it in a thick coating of gunmetal gray, and then let that dry. I aided the drying process a little bit with the blowtorch, which was a bit of a mistake because it ended up causing wrinkling, which I had to redo completely from scratch. Then to make the base where the engine would sit, I put down a small piece of cardboard that fit the interior size and a section of aluminum foil on top of that, which I then crimped around all of the edges to make sure it was all nice and snug, fit in there the way it was supposed to. And finally, I glued my engine down on top of that. I probably used way too much super glue, as you can see here. That droplet is huge. But I ended up taking advantage of that by putting another little foil skirt around the engine. Again, completely unnecessary, as I would never be able to see that. But even still, I was happy with that extra little bit of detail, if but for just the fact that I would know that it's there. To make the actual lander itself, I used cardboard and wire, and coated it in aluminum foil and painted it a nice orange, which I then overlaid with a little bit of bronze or I guess more appropriately, antique brass colored spray paint, which didn't quite get the color that I wanted, but it was pretty close. And to make the legs, I used a hole punch to cut little pieces of cardboard out of a soda box. And here I'm making the actual diorama base itself out of a Japanese curry box that a friend had sent to me over the summer. And to make sure that I don't have to fill the entire thing with sand, I put a bunch of sections of cardboard inside of it to raise the level. And because I didn't want the sand to flow around inside of all those little holes there, which will eventually be used for the craters, I coated it in paper to seal off all of the gaps and holes. Then, while letting that dry, I decided to start working on my moon rocks, which I have never really done before. I just kind of thought up this method and wanted to give it a try. I took droplets of superglue and put them inside plaster of Paris, which is very fine powder that will also be used for the regolith. And once I stirred it around a little bit, the superglue would stick to the plaster of Paris and make these little pebbles, which you could see. But they were way too smooth. They looked more like earth rocks. So to fix that, I experimented with a bunch of different methods and eventually settled on spritzing them with a very fine mist of water, and then pouring more plaster of Paris on top of them and mixing them around. Not really mixing them, but more like shaking them back and forth, as you can see, which I then repeated multiple times until it got a nice volcanic texture almost. Then it was on to making the actual regolith itself, which I made by mixing half and half that plaster of Paris powder with some of the silt or sand from one of the rivers near where I live. I then poured that over the surface, shook it around a little bit to make it more even, and spooned some of the rest down on top. I gave it then a little bit of shake to make sure it was all sintered down, which actually ended up breaking up some of the smaller pieces of the plaster of Paris and bringing them to the surface, which added to the texture in the long run. I then took my collection of marbles to make the craters across the surface. And I also used the blunt end of my various different paintbrushes to make even smaller craters to add to the detail and aesthetics. Now, in reality, the section of the moon that the Blue Ghost lander touched down in, which, as you can see, I'm adding it to the diorama now, to its final resting place. The actual surface of the moon, where the Blue Ghost lander landed, is a little bit more smooth than this, but I wanted to give it some character. I then took the very finest bristles of brush that were sticking out after years of use to make the little bits of regolith that would have gotten kicked up by the thrusters, making little streaks where the pebble and finer rocks and regolith would have been spread out in all different directions. And finally, I added in my moon rocks, which at this point were nice and dry, and I scattered those all about the surface. And finally, the last thing to do was to add a liberal coating of that same gunmetal gray from earlier to the sides of the box that I had used. And I applied multiple heavy coats to get the finish that I had. And there you have it, the Firefly Blue Ghost lander. Now, I've never really done something like this on the channel before, but I hope you all enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making this. If you want to see more content like this in the future, please leave a comment. And until next time, please like and subscribe if you so wish, it would mean the world. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the rain fall softly upon your fields. And until we meet again, keep adventuring.